She mocked his hat, questioned his presence, and tried to remove him from the flight, completely unaware that the man she was humiliating wasn't just a passenger. He owned the airline. Airports are designed to run on systems, boarding groups, seat classes, loyalty statuses. But even the most precise system breaks when bias overrides protocol. The first-class line moved swiftly, but one presence triggered an unexpected disruption. A man, composed and quiet, wore a crisp cap, a red one, instantly recognizable. It wasn't just a hat. To some, it was a statement. To others, a symbol. To one flight attendant, it was a problem. From the moment she saw the red letters, her demeanor shifted. Not professional, not neutral, suspicious. Her voice held an edge, her expression sharpened with each step he took closer to the gate. She asked to see his boarding pass not once, but twice. Not out of procedure, but presumption. She examined it like it had to be fake. A man in a MAGA hat in first class? That didn't fit her mental template. Her eyes searched him for inconsistencies, flaws, signs that he didn't belong in that section of the plane. The other passengers, some indifferent, some curious, watched as she scrutinized the man in a way she hadn't with others. She offered no welcome, no smile, no standard greeting, just a cold interrogation cloaked in company protocol. The man complied silently, no resistance, no protest, just quiet dignity. But silence is often misread. She took his calmness as submission, his politeness as permission to escalate. She questioned the authenticity of his ticket, despite the barcode matching the manifest. She accused him of entering the wrong boarding group, despite the bold Group 1 printed clearly on his pass. Each time, she received a composed response. Each time, her irritation grew. Then came the implication that he must have been upgraded by mistake. Her voice turned condescending, asking if he knew this was the first-class line. She subtly suggested coach might be where he intended to sit. Her tone wasn't curious, it was dismissive, like she couldn't imagine someone like him, a man wearing that hat, sitting in a luxury cabin. The accusation wasn't about policy, it was about perception. Passengers began to shift uncomfortably. Some caught on, others pulled out their phones, sensing a confrontation. But he didn't raise his voice. He didn't throw a fit. He stood with the quiet power of someone who knew exactly who he was, and didn't need to prove it to anyone. Still, she pushed forward. She leaned into the authority of her uniform, trying to exert dominance not earned, but assumed. She told him to wait. She stepped aside to contact her supervisor. She whispered into the phone, using phrases like disruption and non-compliant, words that out of context sounded dangerous, but in truth described nothing more than a calm man in a red cap. It wasn't policy enforcement. It was profiling masked as protocol. The deeper issue wasn't about a hat or a seat. It was about an assumption that wealth, power, and success wore a particular uniform. And he didn't fit it. Not to her. In her view, first class wasn't just about money, it was about image. And that image did not include red hats, plain clothing, or quiet confidence. The irony was lost on her. The harder she tried to remove him, the more she revealed about herself. She wasn't protecting order. She was disrupting it. Her need to correct what didn't need fixing was not professionalism, it was prejudice. Others began to murmur. Some quietly questioned why this man was being singled out. A few stepped in with cautious support, but the attendant brushed them off. She insisted on verification. She told the man he would need to step aside. She said it with the conviction of someone certain they held the upper hand. The man didn't argue. He simply nodded and stepped away. No raised eyebrows, no smugness, just a measured glance at the very people who had treated him like an intruder. And in that glance was a silent message: this won't end the way you think. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate the quietest person in the room. When assumptions drive action and bias overrides policy, justice doesn't just fail, it exposes itself. This wasn't a passenger breaking rules. This was an employee misusing power, not because of what she knew, but because of what she thought she knew. In a space where identity should take a back seat to truth, she had made it the entire vehicle. But truth always catches up, and for the flight attendant, the turbulence was just beginning. The tension in the air was palpable, almost tangible. The flight attendant, already certain in her stance, doubled down on her accusations. The man in the MAGA hat wasn't just out of place in her mind, he was trying to deceive everyone. She believed he was pretending to be something he wasn't. To her, this wasn't about his ticket. This was about his appearance, his attire, and the audacity he had to occupy a first-class seat. She accused him of impersonating a wealthy passenger, suggesting that he was trying to act rich, trying to fit into a world that, in her view, was clearly not for people like him. The judgment wasn't just about the hat, it was about what she perceived to be his lack of status. To her, his casual clothes and lack of obvious luxury screamed imposter. She believed he had no right to the seat he had booked, that he was unworthy of the space he occupied. It wasn't just a challenge to his place on the plane, it was a challenge to his very identity. Other passengers, initially quiet observers, now began to murmur among themselves. Whispers spread throughout the cabin, a quiet undercurrent of curiosity and disbelief. Some passengers had witnessed the exchange from the beginning. Others were just now noticing the escalating tension. It was clear that something wasn't right, and they could feel the discomfort hanging thick in the air. The flight attendant's overbearing behavior, her insistence that the man was out of place, seemed not only out of line, but increasingly inappropriate. The murmurs grew louder, but the attendant was undeterred. She raised her voice to make sure everyone could hear her reasoning. She claimed that his actions were disruptive, that his presence was causing confusion. Her tone grew sharper, her words more accusatory, and the air in the cabin thickened with her growing hostility. The passengers began to notice the way she singled him out, the way she treated him like a trespasser in a space where he had every right to be. Finally, she made her move. She didn't just ask him to step aside. She called security. The decision was quick, as though it was the only course of action that made sense. Her authority was absolute in her mind, and the situation could only be resolved by removing the man from the plane. She didn't consider that she might be wrong. She didn't pause to think that there might be more to this situation than she understood. Her belief in her own correctness blinded her to the possibility that her actions might be far more damaging than she realized. And then, as security arrived, something unexpected happened. The man, still calm, was instructed to stay put. The tension mounted in the cabin, but it was no longer just between the attendant and the passenger, it was also between the flight crew and the passengers, who were now fully aware that something was going terribly wrong. A quiet conversation began at the back of the plane. The airport supervisor had been contacted. She was briefed on the situation, and as she made her way toward the confrontation, the flight attendant stood rigidly by, confident that the situation was under control. But when the supervisor arrived and saw the man, the atmosphere shifted. A simple look passed between the supervisor and the man in the hat, and immediately the atmosphere shifted again. The flight attendant watched, her face slowly losing color as she realized something no one had expected. The supervisor, composed and calm, turned to the flight attendant and said just a few words, enough to make the situation unravel completely. In an instant, the identity of the man was revealed. He wasn't just a random passenger, some imposter trying to claim a seat he didn't deserve. He wasn't someone who had somehow cheated the system to sneak into a higher class. He was, in fact, the very person who owned the airline. The revelation hit hard. It wasn't just a correction, it was a correction of everything that had just transpired. The flight attendant's assumptions, her quick judgment, her blatant disregard for the man's dignity, all of it came crashing down. In an instant, the man was no longer just a passenger. He was the very thing she had failed to see, the most powerful person in the room, the one who set the rules she had been enforcing. The faces around the cabin went pale. The realization spread like wildfire, not just through the flight crew, but to every corner of the plane. The passengers who had watched the exchange unfold began to process what had just happened. The attendant, once confident and self-assured, now stood rooted in a moment of crushing realization. It wasn't just that she had made a mistake, it was that she had, in her own mind, decided he didn't belong before even knowing who he was. She had based her judgment on her own biases, assuming that someone in a MAGA hat had no business sitting in first class. And that assumption had cost her everything. In a world where perception can be reality, the flight attendant had learned an important lesson in humility. Her assumptions, built on surface-level judgments, had failed her in the most spectacular way. The truth was simple. Power doesn't always look the way you expect it to. It doesn't always arrive in the form you anticipate. And often it's hidden in plain sight, disguised behind labels and stereotypes that society has conditioned us to believe. And now, the very person she had tried to eject from the flight wasn't just her passenger, he was her employer. The balance of power had shifted, and there was no escaping the truth that had just been exposed. As the truth came to light, the weight of the situation descended with the finality of a crashing wave. The man, who had quietly endured the flight attendant's accusations and her attempt to remove him from his rightful place, was no ordinary passenger. The shock was not just in the revelation that he was someone important. It was in the realization that he was the most important person aboard. The flight attendant had thought she was just enforcing the rules. She believed she was protecting the integrity of the first-class section from what she perceived as an interloper, someone who did not meet the unwritten standards of the upper class. In her mind, the MAGA hat was a symbol of everything she thought didn't belong in a luxury cabin. She had no idea that by trying to assert her authority over this man, she was not only insulting him, but also making the worst mistake of her career. The supervisor who had arrived on the scene was unfazed by the drama unfolding. She wasn't concerned about the confrontation. She wasn't even fazed by the fact that the situation had spiraled out of control. Her eyes flickered over the man in the red cap, and without any outward reaction, she gave a single nod. This small gesture was the turning point. With that nod, the attendant's world shattered. The supervisor turned to her, speaking in measured tones, as if to cut through the tension. "You can't ask him to leave. He is the CEO of this airline." The flight attendant's face drained of color, her eyes widening as the words sank in. Her jaw tightened, but no words escaped her. The man in the MAGA hat wasn't just some wealthy traveler. He was the one who held the keys to the entire operation, the man who signed the checks, the one whose name was on the board of every important decision. He was the one who had built this airline from the ground up, and he was the one whose rules governed everything from the cockpit to the customer service desk. In the silence that followed, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The passengers who had been watching the confrontation from their seats began to murmur in disbelief. Some had guessed that there was more to the man than met the eye, but they had no idea how much more. Others began to understand the magnitude of the situation, realizing that the flight attendant had just tried to remove the very person who made her job possible. The flight crew, who had been standing by, were now faced with an uncomfortable truth. They had watched as their colleague made a series of assumptions that were now exposed as not just incorrect, but dangerously misguided. The first-class passengers, who had been quietly observing the events unfold, now knew exactly what had happened. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to a mix of astonishment and, in some cases, quiet amusement. It was clear that no one expected this turn of events. The flight attendant, who had acted with the certainty of someone who was in control, now felt the weight of her mistake. Her face reddened as the shock of the revelation sunk in. She had not only misjudged a passenger, she had misjudged the very man who was the foundation of the airline. The power dynamics had shifted in a single moment, and it was now painfully clear that the flight attendant had overstepped in a way she could never undo. But the consequences didn't stop there. The man who had quietly endured the interrogation now stood tall, his presence commanding the respect of everyone in the cabin. His composure, in contrast to the frantic energy of the flight attendant, became a silent but powerful declaration of authority. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't demanded any special treatment. He had simply allowed the truth to reveal itself. And in doing so, he had turned the tables completely. The flight attendant, now realizing her error, was left with nothing to say. The supervisor, still calm, informed her that she would be formally addressing the matter once the flight was over. There was no scolding, no shouting, just the quiet understanding that the mistake had been made and that it could not be undone. It wasn't just a matter of procedural error, it was a matter of respect, and that respect could never be fully regained in this moment. As the truth spread through the cabin, the passengers began to understand the true nature of power and perception. The MAGA hat, which had initially been a symbol of the man's supposed out-of-place status, was now a symbol of the very thing the flight attendant had failed to recognize: authority, influence, and control. The hat no longer represented a stereotype. It represented the man who had the ability to shape the airline industry, the man whose decisions impacted the lives of countless people. But what was most striking about the situation was not just the revelation itself. It was the way the man handled it. Despite the attempted humiliation, despite the unprovoked assumption that he didn't belong, he remained dignified and composed. His silence had spoken volumes more than any defense could have. In the world of high power, silence often carries the weight of the most important message. Actions speak louder than words, and often the quietest person in the room holds the most control. As the flight attendant stood, unable to do anything but absorb the shock of her mistake, the CEO of the airline quietly returned to his seat. His actions were deliberate, measured. The message was clear: power does not need to be asserted aggressively. It does not need to be screamed from the rooftops. True authority is carried quietly with a sense of purpose and an understanding of the responsibility that comes with it. And as the plane began to taxi, the world outside the window seemed a little smaller. In that cabin, power had shifted, not in the way anyone had expected, but in a way that would be remembered for a long time. In a world where emotions often dictate actions and public figures are scrutinized for every word and gesture, the true measure of power often lies not in reaction, but in restraint. The man in the MAGA hat, despite the very public humiliation he had just endured, remained the epitome of composure. There was no anger in his eyes, no defensiveness in his posture. He did not raise his voice or attempt to justify himself. In a moment that could have spiraled into chaos, he chose calm, and that calm became the most powerful statement of all. As the flight attendant stood frozen, her earlier confidence now replaced with an overwhelming sense of regret, the man simply allowed the silence to fill the room. His silence was not born out of fear or a desire to avoid conflict. It was a silent declaration of strength. Where many might have lashed out in response to such an assault on their dignity, he chose to let the truth unfold on its own, knowing that no words were necessary to assert his authority. In a society where we are often encouraged to speak up, to stand up for ourselves, and to make our voices heard at all costs, the man's decision to remain quiet was a stark contrast. But it was in that quiet strength that he revealed something more powerful than any shouting match or dramatic confrontation could have ever conveyed. His dignity was not something that could be shaken by accusations or assumptions. It was rock, solid, unyielding, and it commanded respect without ever needing to demand it. The entire cabin could feel the weight of the moment. The passengers who had been nervously watching the interaction unfold now saw something entirely different. They saw not a man who was seeking to prove himself, but someone who knew exactly who he was. He didn't need to react to the flight attendant's behavior, because he understood that the truth would inevitably come to light, and when it did, it would speak louder than any defense or counterargument could. This is where true professionalism lives, at the intersection of composure and control. The man's quiet response was a masterclass in emotional intelligence. He did not let the petty assumptions or judgments of others dictate his actions. His ability to remain unflustered in the face of public criticism was not a sign of weakness. Rather, it demonstrated an unparalleled level of self-awareness. He understood that in moments like this, the loudest person in the room is often the weakest, and the most powerful person is the one who can remain unshaken. In a world where people are often quick to react, to defend their egos or reputations, the man's silence was a rebuke to the very idea that we must always fight back when our dignity is challenged. He showed that sometimes the most dignified response is no response at all. The flight attendant's aggressive accusations, her attempts to tear him down, were nothing more than fleeting noise in the grand scheme of things. The man's ability to remain steady, unaffected by the drama, demonstrated that true power lies in the ability to remain above it all, watching as the world works itself out around you. And while the flight attendant was left reeling from her actions, the other passengers were left to reflect on what they had just witnessed. They had seen a spectacle unfold, one that at first seemed like a simple misunderstanding. But as the truth came to light, they realized that they had been spectators in a lesson on personal strength, leadership, and the true nature of authority. What many of them had not seen was the broader significance of the man's behavior. His response wasn't just about handling the situation in front of him, it was about setting a standard for how to deal with adversity in life. How many times do we, in our own lives, allow petty insults, unfair criticisms, or simple misunderstandings to send us into a spiral of frustration and defensiveness? How often do we feel the need to correct others, to defend our image, to lash out when we're wronged? The man in the MAGA hat showed them all that there is power in taking a step back. By not rushing to prove himself, by not falling into the trap of ego or pride, he demonstrated a mastery over his emotions that was far more impressive than any verbal confrontation could have been. His restraint wasn't passive, it was active. He made a conscious choice to let his dignity, rather than his words, speak for him. In doing so, he transformed the situation from one of confrontation to one of reflection. The true nature of professionalism, it seemed, wasn't about how we perform when the spotlight is on us, but how we handle ourselves when the spotlight is on others. The flight attendant had tried to project authority, but her actions spoke of insecurity and a lack of true understanding of her position. The man, by contrast, embodied the kind of quiet authority that commands respect from the moment he enters the room. He knew that real power doesn't come from exerting control over others, but from mastering control over oneself. The passengers, many of whom had been uncomfortable with the way the flight attendant had handled the situation, were now beginning to reassess what they had witnessed. They had expected him to retaliate, to raise his voice, to make a scene. But instead, he had simply allowed the truth to speak for itself. And in doing so, he had gained something far more valuable than a momentary victory in a battle of words. He had gained the unwavering respect of everyone in that cabin. As the plane continued its journey through the skies, there was an undeniable shift in the energy of the flight. The man had not just reclaimed his space, he had redefined the very nature of authority. The flight attendant, though her actions had been deeply flawed, had inadvertently participated in a moment of profound education. In attempting to exert control over him, she had been reminded that true authority is never about force, it's about grace under pressure. And as the journey continued, the lesson remained. The man had proven that true strength comes not from reacting, but from rising above the fray. The flight attendant would never forget the power of restraint, the power of dignity that remained unshaken, even in the face of public humiliation. It was a lesson that would resonate with everyone who had witnessed it, a reminder that the greatest power lies not in what we say, but in how we choose to behave when others expect us to react. The flight may have continued its course, but the ramifications of what had just unfolded were far from over. The incident, once a private altercation in the skies, quickly turned into something much larger. The reality of the situation began to take root both within the walls of the airline's headquarters and across the wider public, and with each passing moment, the consequences would unravel in ways no one had initially anticipated. At the core of it all was the flight attendant. Her actions, which she had deemed a simple enforcement of policy, had spiraled into a catastrophic misjudgment. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was the identity of the man she had tried to eject from his seat. To her, he was just another passenger. a man whose political affiliation, symbolized by his MAGA hat, made him seem out of place in the luxurious world of first-class air travel. But she had made a critical error, one that would cost her much more than just the immediate embarrassment of her blunder. Once the plane landed, it didn't take long for the story to spread. In an age where every moment, every interaction is recorded and shared, the confrontation had been captured and uploaded to social media before the aircraft had even touched down. Passengers had snapped pictures, shared videos, and offered their own perspectives on the situation. What had been a single encounter between a flight attendant and a passenger had now become a viral sensation. It was a drama that was tailor-made for the public's insatiable appetite for conflict, complete with the shocking twist of the man's true identity. The video quickly made its rounds across social media platforms, sparking intense debates about political symbols, class divides, and the treatment of individuals based on superficial judgments. Comments flooded in, with some siding with the flight attendant's initial actions, arguing that the man's MAGA hat represented divisiveness and hate. Others, however, pointed to the flight attendant's overreach and her inability to recognize the true nature of her passenger. The division was palpable, but one thing was certain: the story was spreading like wildfire. The airline, in a move that was both expected and necessary, issued a public statement. They apologized to the passenger and assured the public that they would conduct a full internal review of the incident. But behind the corporate facade, the truth was more uncomfortable. The flight attendant's actions were a blatant violation of company policy. Not only had she embarrassed herself, but she had also caused significant damage to the airline's reputation. The question now was how the company would respond to the fallout. Would they stand behind their employee, or would they take decisive action to show that such behavior would not be tolerated? In the coming days, the pressure mounted. The flight attendant was placed on paid leave while the investigation into the incident was underway. Behind closed doors, the airline's management team faced difficult decisions. The man who had been the center of the controversy was not just another wealthy businessman. He was the very CEO of the airline, a person who had helped shape the company into what it was today. His influence stretched far beyond the cabin of one flight. The airline's leadership was well aware of the fact that this scandal could have far-reaching consequences for their brand. The backlash from the public was already palpable, and any further missteps could be catastrophic. As for the flight attendant, the writing was on the wall. Regardless of the outcome of the investigation, her career in the airline industry was hanging by a thread. The viral nature of the incident meant that she was now known for something far more significant than her work in customer service. She had become a symbol of the dangers of making assumptions based on appearance and political ideology. Her actions, though rooted in personal bias, had now been elevated to a cautionary tale for others in her field and beyond. She had unintentionally become the face of everything that could go wrong when we fail to see the humanity in others and instead judge them based on preconceived notions. The man, meanwhile, remained quiet in the aftermath. He had no need to publicize his version of the events. His silence spoke volumes, especially as the story spread and his role in it became clearer. The internet was abuzz with discussions about the flight attendant's treatment of him, and many pointed out the ironic twist of her attempting to eject the very person who was, in essence, her employer. But the man did not seek revenge. He did not need to add fuel to the fire. His position, his authority, was not defined by how loudly he spoke, but by how others responded to him. In fact, the man had made a conscious choice to let the situation unfold without his direct involvement. He had not rushed to the media to tell his side of the story, nor had he posted anything on social media about the incident. His actions remained measured, even as the world watched with bated breath. To him, the public spectacle was nothing more than noise, a temporary distraction in the grand scheme of things. His focus was on the long term. And in the long term, he understood that respect and authority were not earned through public confrontations, but through actions that proved integrity and decisiveness over time. However, behind the scenes, the effects of the incident rippled outward. The flight attendant faced increasing pressure from the public, her every move scrutinized by a digital audience that had already made up its mind. Her actions had been the catalyst for a deeper conversation about the dangers of judgment, bias, and the need for more empathy in our interactions with others. She had been caught in a storm of her own making, and now she had to contend with the fallout. For the airline, the consequences were not limited to just one employee's actions. They were now responsible for managing the narrative, for ensuring that their brand remained intact despite the controversy. A series of internal meetings were held to review customer service protocols, emphasizing the importance of treating all passengers with dignity and respect, regardless of their political affiliation, appearance, or beliefs. The incident had sparked a larger discussion about the role of customer service representatives in shaping the experience of passengers and the potential consequences of misjudging those whom they served. The story of the man in the MAGA hat and the flight attendant would go down as a stark reminder that respect cannot be assumed or taken for granted. It must be earned through understanding, humility, and a willingness to look beyond the surface. The consequences of one person's hasty judgment had rippled through the skies, affecting not just the individuals involved, but the larger conversation about societal divides and the importance of maintaining dignity in all our interactions. In the end, the lesson was clear. The power of respect is not in what we wear or how we appear, but in how we treat others, how we choose to look past superficial judgments, and how we recognize the worth in everyone, no matter their background or beliefs. And while the flight continued, the lessons from that day would stick with everyone who had witnessed it. For more incredible stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Expect Stories and hit the bell icon.